Hi, I'm B from Next Mechanics, and welcome back to my Soul Shaded Jazz project. In today's part 4, we make the transformation animation. So for those of you who've not watched the other videos, in part 1, I made a 2D animatic planning out my animation, and then started modeling the car in Blender. In part 2, I cut up that car and made the robot mode out of it. In part 3, we made the backgrounds, compositing, new textures, Blaster's vehicle mode. So now, after a month's worth of work, we finally have enough to actually start animating with. To start off with, we need to copy our file and start working in that one. We don't want to accidentally break something and not have an original. So as per my 2D animatic, I want him to drive in car mode, and then transform into the robot mode in a semi-dramatic style, but also being fairly snappy. To do this, I set up my camera initially, looking down the tunnel, making sure the lighting was right, getting just the basic car mode model to slide along. I've also rigged up the wheels with the basic armature so that they can spin properly. Now, while I could animate this scene all as one big giant thing, my computer is not particularly fast at rendering, and I want us to be able to use it. So for each camera change, I'm going to make it swap to be a new render that I can edit together in DaVinci Resolve later on. That way I could just let it render overnight and review the footage in the morning and edit it. So once we did a very basic car driving along, we then needed to actually do the hard part, which is making him transform. I got my mid-transform model, which is obviously the robot mode, squished up with some extra pieces, like the car, and lined him up to where the car model left off. Now I'm just going to hide the layer of that car model, and this is really useful because what it means is that it won't render that object or any of the stuff in that collection, so we can just focus on what we need. Now, animation from a technical standpoint isn't particularly hard. You choose where you want it to be on the timeline at the bottom. You press I to insert a keyframe. I always typically tend to insert location and rotation. Then you move further along the timeline, move the object to where you want it to be in that space of time, insert another keyframe, and then Blender will interpolate the in-between frames so it slides along. So initially it's very easy, right? I need the car to just slide along into the middle of the frame so that it's more centered. And we can also keyframe the camera moving so it slides around them a little so it's not just static. But the actual transformation is a little bit harder because we, one, need to make sure none of the individual pieces clip through each other, which is basically where they slide through each other because it's all digital, they don't actually exist. I also need to make sure that he doesn't clip through the floor. Even if it's only slightly, people will pick up on it. And then the weight and the movement of everything needs to feel natural. Now obviously, I'm not a Cybertronian, but I can squat. So I set up my camera, squatted into a little ball, and recorded myself stretching upwards a couple times, trying to figure out how do I show the weight, how does this move realistically? Then, like I did in part 2, I imported that image directly into Blender so I could use it as a reference. Now, while I didn't use this too often, the couple times that I did need to glance at it was super useful. It's just weird things like, where do the legs go? What point should the arms stop holding onto the ground? Do I need to readjust the hands? All these little tiny nuances getting replicated in Blender just helps sell it. Now there was a couple times where the pieces didn't move quite right, there wasn't enough segments, so even though I thought I planned everything right, in the end I had to cut it up into more chunks so that way it could actually physically move in those spaces. More so at the end than right now. Right now, we're just trying to block out the basic movements, and after a day's worth of work, I already had something that was starting to look pretty cool. Sure, the weight and the movement is very jank, and the frame rate is absolutely choppy as heck because I haven't rendered it, but it's showing that the model is already looking better than the Optimus. So now that I've basically blocked it out, I basically get to spend a week just refining it. Now, sometimes my armature was a little bit funky, and because the origin points and stuff had all been messed up from how I squished it together into the car mode, a lot of times I was fighting with myself, because if I set the origin to object, that messes it all up with the way it's linked to the armature. So I had to just awkwardly move it from the center point that wasn't where it naturally looked like it should be. So I made my life a lot harder than I needed to. That's alright, I had plenty of time to just fiddle with it. And fiddle I did, trying to make sure that the arms and stuff look a bit better. What if they actually slid out initially, and then they help push them up like a presser? That looks a lot better than them just sort of hanging there by the sides. I also wanted his left foot to sort of raise and stomp. It kind of adds a little bit more than just him stretching. The head, I also did little things like making sure that it sort of unfurls rather than just hinges. If you add that little extra movement and that weight and stuff, it's gonna sell it. Now, in the end, I still don't think I fully nailed it, but these little tweaks made it look a lot better. Now, his arms were a pain because they're actually two separate objects and they're not parented properly due to how I cut it up for the transformation, so I had to constantly manually realign them all the time. Thankfully, the left arm can't really be seen till halfway through, so I just had it squished up and out of the way until you could. Now, I would have loved to have added a floor constraint to the bums so that I didn't have to manually make sure he doesn't clip through the ground, but if I did, due to the way his armature is squished up in the car mode, he'd be hovering along the ground slightly because his foot is further up than the wheels. So I just spent hours manually making sure his feet didn't clip through the ground, and while it's not perfect, if you don't look for it, you can't tell in the final animation. I also made sure that his face wasn't just completely static. I utilized those shape keys I made to make him smile, just as his head uncurls, just to add that little bit extra. Also making sure that those armature pole rigs for his roof actually line up properly. They keep wiggling around a little, because again, they're not parented properly, so I had to just manually make sure that they all lined up correctly. I think if I got to spend more time on just this in-between car model, I could probably make my life a lot easier by fixing these parenting issues, but basically I decided to brute force it. And after a few days of tweaking, we had this animation, which is about 90% of where I want it to be, but obviously he's missing his front wheels, his face looks a little too static, the legs are actually clipping through the ground along with his feet, the armature poles are wiggling around everywhere, and it doesn't feel quite weighty enough. So I went back into Blender and started fixing it up. The wheels was easy, I just accidentally had them hidden on the layer. But stuff like the shape keys, I could just adjust the sliders so he only smiles at the very end. You can keyframe shape keys, that's how I'm doing it here. For the legs, I had to just chop up that car piece and make it rotate so that it doesn't clip through the ground. Readjust the feet so they stop clipping. I also got a recommendation of making the visor change color to sort of activate when he's online, which I thought was great. I fiddled with those bloody armature poles again. Jeez, they're being a pain. And try my best to just add a little bit more gravity to him. Also, make sure the wheels actually rotate when the legs ping back. That's gonna help it a lot. Now, you might notice in some of these test animations that I've been showing you that the frame rate's a little funky. On that initial gray one, that's just because it's not rendered. But on that test one with the no wheels, that's actually deliberate. I'm using a stop-mo add-on by Southern Shotty that allows me to get a sort of Spider-Verse effect, which I think is brilliant. It basically takes those curved interpolations between each object movement and adds steps in them to make it more like stop motion. And it really helps when you're making a transformation like this because each piece just clunks and snaps and it just looks a lot better. So once we've done that, I think we have our final render. But before I show you it, I also need to edit it together because on its own, without any audio, it doesn't feel quite right. So I took the transformation sound from Optimus Prime and Age of Extinction, Bumblebee's Transformers Prime driving sound, the ending music to all the original G1 episodes. Another G1 noise was that VWAP sound for his visor, and a tire screech sound by Berlin Atmospheres. So I took that initial render of him in the tunnel, which it doesn't have a stop motion filter, so it looks a little smoother, a bit more speedy. Then I stitched on that final animation render, clipped together all the sounds in the exact right timing as I need, and eventually we have our transformation now. It's only 8 seconds long. I know, 4 months of work for 8 seconds. But this is only a small section of what the animation is going to be. Next week, we're going to be animating dancing and having Blaster come in and do an awful lot more. But for now, please enjoy my transformation. That's, a little bit better than my first transformation, eh? Here's a side-by-side between Optimus Prime and Jazz. One clearly looks a bit better than the other, don't you think? I love the way all the segments sort of click and interlock and separate. This is really good progress, and I'm actually really proud of how I've managed to do this. Bear in mind, I only started animating consistently, like, a couple months ago. So what do you think? Does the stop motion effect look cool? Does it add to that Spider-Verse aesthetic like I'm trying to emulate? Do you have any tips on anything that you might want to tweak with it? Remember, this isn't the final animation, that's still a couple weeks away, so there's time to change things now. Otherwise, I'm very pleased with this, and I hope you enjoyed it too. And if you enjoy Transformers content on the channel, maybe check out my Cybertronian Saturdays. I've not done an awful lot of them recently due to learning inverse kinematics and compositing in Blender, but I have a backlog that you can go check out, and I've got some really fun ones on like Rise of the Beast figures and stuff. So if you do enjoy, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a notification for next week's update video, where we make him dance. Catch you next week. Farewell!